Hello, this is Spike in Glasgow on the bridge. The session is just starting, and I'd like to introduce Mike, who's going to be the moderator for this event, coming in from a remote site. And Mike, the floor is yours. This is Spike in Glasgow to Mike. You are live. The session has begun. Mike, you have the floor. Mike in Glasgow to Mike. Do you hear me through the system? 1, 2, 3. This is Spike talking to Mike. Does he have his speaker turned off? His microphone's on. This is Spike in Glasgow in the bridge to Mike. As soon as we're ready, we can commence the session. Do you want to phone him again and say that he's live on air and everyone's watching him and listening to him?
Hi.
Tell me if I'm broadcasting to him, Neil. 1, 2, 3. This is Spike to Mike.
I guess
you are live. The session
we are
has
live.
begun. Over to you.
I cannot hear or see anything. So I'll just start talking and hope that you can hear me. Welcome everybody to our event, The Political Economy of Coal and its Implication for Clean Energy Transitions. The last years have seen quite impressive shifts away from coal on a global scale. So many countries have actually moved on from coal towards renewables. And this COP has apparently made quite important progress towards a global coal phase-out. So 28 new members have joined the Power and Past Coal Alliance. Important countries such as Indonesia, the Philippines, and South Africa have announced that they will partner with the Climate Investment Fund to accelerate their coal phase-outs. There's been this landmark deal with South Africa to support the clean energy transition. 20 new countries, such as Vietnam, Morocco, Poland, have committed to building no new coal power plants. And there has been the UK-led joint declaration on ending global finance for coal power. So this is, of course, a very encouraging step towards phasing out coal, towards achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement. The important question is, of course, how can we make this happen in practice? What actually needs to take place on the ground? How can we make coal phase out politically feasible given country-specific circumstances? This is what we want to explore in this panel. We have 5 distinguished speakers. First, my colleague Jan Steckel from the MCC will give an overview presentation of a long-term joint research project we've been undertaking. And then we will have 4 country deep dives. One from Cecilia Hans Springer from Boston University, who's a senior researcher, who will inform us about the most recent development in China. Then Kos Nefjes, who's director of Wider Sense in Vietnam, will give us an overview of the situation in Vietnam. Then Neva Makleta, who's a senior economist at the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategies in South Africa, will tell us more about the just transition there. And finally, Felix Mattes, who is the research coordinator for energy and climate policy at the Öko Institute, will give us some insights on the coal phase out in Germany. This will be followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A. So I'm supposed to moderate this. I hope we can make the technology work until then. If not, I'll have to pass over to perhaps Lina to take care of this. In any case, I would like to ask you to be very strict on time, because we only have 75 minutes for this panel, and I would like to have everyone participate and get a chance to present their insights. So with this, I hand over to Jan, who will start with an overview on the political economy of coal and the insights from case studies in 15 countries. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm very excited to have this panel, and also a warm welcome from us here in Glasgow. So what I'm going to do is to kick off this session by giving a summary of actually book project that we have preparing over the last 2 years, where we have actually been going into deep dives of the political economy of coal in 15 countries. So just a short reminder, why are we so interested in coal? Well, coal by itself actually is the most emissions intensive fuel, and it actually would, if basically everything that is currently under construction, operating and planned, would basically bring us to committed emissions of approximately 300 gigatons of coal as of January this year. However, the available carbon budget that we still have to achieve the 1.5 degree target is about 400 to 500 gigatons only. So this would actually eat up a large share of this, and also actually make the achievement of a 2 degree target quite unlikely. In fact, actually, if we look into model and scenario results, they frequently tell us that in this decade, to achieve 1.5 or even 2 degree targets, we will need to reduce actually coal capacity across the globe, including in those countries that currently still construct and plan new capacities in Asia or South Africa or Japan, etc. So, however, when we have seen some great advancements here at the COP, and some great announcements by actually countries announcing that they would like to phase out coal. However, we need to acknowledge that basically when we talk about energy transitions, this is not only just an economic issue, having basically heard about renewable energy getting cheaper and cheaper, but it actually depends on politics quite a bit. So what we need to understand is who would be affected in what way by climate policy, and how can these actors support or block policy formulation and implementation. So what we have done in this book is that we have relied on a systematic approach using a framework from the academic literature that we had developed before, called the Actors, Objectives and Context Framework, which I do not want to introduce in detail, but just to give you the basic idea, basically this framework says that those policies will be implemented that best serve the interests of those actors that have the greatest influence on their design and implementation. So what we did is that we basically went through a systematic country-specific approach, including countries that are established coal users, such as China, India, or Turkey, countries that are very large in exporting coal, including in Australia, Indonesia, South Africa, and Colombia, countries that phase in coal, including Kenya, Philippines, and Vietnam, and countries that are currently phasing out coal, including Chile, Bulgaria, the US, UK, and Germany. So we can say that we basically cover the full bandwidth of countries and how they actually deal with coal. In this book, covering approximately 3/4 of the operating fleet and 83% of what is in the pipeline. We find actually that for all of these categories, we find very distinct political economy challenges that I would like to introduce to you next. The framework that we are using really relies on actually objectives. So what we would like to understand is who basically would like to have what kind of objective first. So acknowledging that various actors, also powerful actors, and in countries that phase in or phase out coal, like multiple objectives might stand next to each other, including security of supply, including affordability, including climate or other environmental targets. However, what you can see is that when here, for example, looking into affordability, that there are distinct differences how important those objectives are in various countries. Let's talk about affordability first. So, of course, obviously, providing affordable electricity is a key objective in most countries. It ensures competitiveness of domestic industry, and there in many countries, particularly in those that are currently phasing in coal, there is very limited political leeway to increase electricity prices. At the same time, in those countries, prices are often too low to cover the energy system cost, which leads to some kind of a some pressure to actually build the cheapest option, simply because there is already an implicit subsidy that puts pressure on public budgets. At the same time, in many countries in the global south, we observe that coal still is the cheapest option. That might sound odd to those of you who come from developed countries, having learned that now basically wind and solar have become cheaper and cheaper, and the same is slowly also getting true in countries of the global south. However, we still face a problem that the high capital intensity of alternatives plus high capital cost, which is a function of, for example, policy risk, still or have favored coal for a long time. And in addition, when we think of alternatives to coal, then we also need additional capital requirements for building up energy systems that are based on renewable energy technologies. However, what we also find in our book in case studies of countries that have phased out coal already or basically are in the middle of doing so, that once alternatives became really cheaper, for example, in the US or UK, coal has phased out much more rapidly than has been previously thought of. Or in the example of Vietnam, and I'm sure that Koos will basically pick up on this, that a change in regulations, how actually the energy market works, and basically how particular different technologies are paid, so to say, this has led to a boom in renewable energy investments. Let's have a look in a second important objective, and this is the case of energy security. And here, I think it is important to understand that when we talk about energy security, then it refers to multiple aspects. At the one hand side, it refers to import independence. However, it also relies to reliable energy supply. Looking into these two sides of energy security, reducing import dependence is frequently stated in countries with abundant coal reserves, including Indonesia, Turkey, Australia, and South Africa. However, this argument can somehow be challenged because one might say that energy sources, for example, from wind or solar, also produce electricity locally. However, the access to technologies might be different. And here, at least until very recently, China, Japan, and Korea have secured that coal technology is cheaply available. And I'm sure that that Cecilia will basically say a few words about the prominence and the importance of now China having basically said that they, as the last country still providing public finance for coal, will basically withdraw from this. However, what we also find is that kind of argument of energy security is often rather brought forward as a pretext to secure existing employment, profits, and revenues from coal. This is different to the reliability aspect, though. So coal is praised for providing baseload capacity. It is an established technology that policymakers feel confident with regarding handling. They feel that this is something that they can deal with also institutionally and technologically, whereas renewable energy technologies pose technical, financial, administrative, and institutional challenges that they sometimes feel they cannot deal with. When it comes to climate and other environmental objectives, it is important that climate change mitigation is a major driver in high-income countries. However, it is in low- and middle-income countries often an objective that is surely important, but not as important as other objectives, for example, keeping up with high energy demand, keeping electricity prices low, and ensuring economic growth. And Interestingly also that other environmental considerations, for example, local air pollution, are not that important for national policy, at least not in the short term. But there is an interesting feature to that, that kind of local air pollution, for example, from coal, offers a possibility for resistance from civil society, and this is something that we have observed in Kenya or also in Vietnam following smog episodes or accidents. Lastly, let me talk a little bit about the question of private profit and vested interest. So vested interests we find are often closely connected to regional actors and interests independent of the governance structure. So this is true in a very federal ruled country such as India and also more centrally organized countries such as Vietnam. We identify in these 15 case studies 4 major ways how countries influence energy policy in their self-interest. This is one, a channel about jobs, an argument that is often brought forward even though the absolute loss of jobs is rather unimportant. However, the concentration of jobs is. So some regions really rely on jobs on coal. Then this is also linked to regional development. So here coal is often at least thought to be linked to positive spillovers and industrialization, hence development, which again are important policy objectives. Then the question of royalties. So it is not only an important source of government revenues at multiple levels, not only at the federal or national level, but also at regional levels, but it is also often connected to other societal goals, for example, achieving decentralization in Indonesia or closely connected to the peace process in Colombia. And finally, lobbying in primary, well, this is maybe the least surprising. So the coal industry has been politically very well connected and actively supporting policymakers, for example, in government, in parliaments, etc. And in addition, coal, in contrast to renewables, to many renewables, it offers multiple business opportunities along the value chain. Think of transport, think of ash removal, etc. So when it comes to the political economy, what we also find is that there are 2 important structural factors that basically facilitate or make it more complicated to phase out coal. One is actually the question of multi-level governance. So subnational actors, I already said, that often have a major say in policymakers. This is important. Second is that particularly in the countries of the EU, we find that there is a very strong role to play for supranational policies, for example, by the EU, bringing forward EU ETS or other climate policies. Then there is a very important role to play for donors and international networks. Think, for example, of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and incentives that were given to invest in coal here. And then finally, as we are here at COP, the international community regarding reputation, international standing is also kind of important and putting pressure for countries to actually act in this direction. The second structural factor, a little bit unrelated to that, is the structure of energy markets. So we have observed that where power markets are liberalized, coal was replaced quickly when other alternatives got cheaper. That was true in the US, it was true in the UK, it was also true in Chile, for example, by natural gas or decreasing costs of renewable energies. And in the case of the UK climate levy, also by climate policy interventions. However, the opposite is true, where energy markets are very highly regulated, which offers a huge entry door for vested interests and private profits that then resists coal phase out. Sometimes the market design actually favors coal. That has been the case in Vietnam. It is still the case in Turkey, where lignite power gets a feed-in tariff. And we should be aware that liberalization of energy markets is not necessarily a guarantee for a successful phase-out. For example, as could be observed in the Philippines, where large private conglomerates control the market and partly oppose the phase-out of coal. So let's come to a conclusion. What does it actually mean for policies? Because we think that actually when thinking of policies that phase out coal, we need to take these realities into account. For those countries that we labeled phase-out countries, US, UK, Germany, Bulgaria, etc., here we actually think that carbon pricing can be an important tool for policymaking, combined with some support for renewables and a strengthening of multi-level governance structures. This is, however, different for established coal users. Here, we think that a measure such a carbon price might actually not be the right tool. Here, we might need to see power market reforms first, institutional reforms first, for example, to break up the strong ties between different state-owned enterprises, between regulators and regulated entities. And additionally, we might see some compensation schemes, including for workers, but also for asset owners. When it comes to phased-in countries, remember these are often countries that are rather at the lower income end of low and middle income countries. Here we really need to make sure that investing into alternatives to coal, clean alternatives to coal, become less riskier, have a stable policy environment. So de-risking might be the most important thing here, combined with some technical assistance to really enable power grids with high shares of intermittent renewable energy electricity. And last but not least, for export-oriented countries also we see a strong need for institutional reforms. First, breaking the strong political ties between the coal mining industry and policymakers, but then also thinking of compensation schemes, for example, for workers, but again, also for asset owners, and of course support the alternative export opportunities. And this is of course just a short glance arguably of a book that covers 15 case studies. It will come out in February, The Political Economy of Coal. If you are interested in more details, you can also check out our website. And I look very much forward now to the inputs by Cecilia, Felix, Groß, and Niva on China, Germany, Vietnam, and South Africa, giving some deep dive perspectives. With that, I hand over to Cecilia. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you so much, Jan. It's great to be here today and participating in this project now for several years. And so today I want to present about the more near-term developments in China's energy sector that are affecting the coal market and hopefully tie that back to the book chapter, which is more meant to discuss longer-term trends in the politics of China's coal sector. As I'm sure our audience has heard, China has in recent months been experiencing an energy crunch in some regions with electricity supply issues. And I want to provide some context for this situation. So what's driving the energy crunch? It's important to keep in mind that China's total final electricity consumption has grown dramatically over the past few decades. It's grown over 20 times from 1980 until now. And that the industrial sector, shown in black here, is the largest consumer of electricity in China, around 70% of electricity going to industry. And also keep in mind that China's electricity, the majority, around 2/3, is supplied by coal. And so to paint this situation in terms of the actor objectives context framework that Jan introduced, what we're seeing with this energy crunch is a problem with dueling objectives. So we have an energy security issue with regards to securing coal supply to power electricity generating stations in the country. At the same time, China is prioritizing economic recovery post-pandemic through rapid return of industrial activity. So industry is largely what's driving this demand for electricity, and via electricity for coal. And so the NDRC has announced energy security measures for this winter as coal demand for heating and for industrial activity are increasing. And this includes boosting the fuel supply to the power sector, and then finding ways to pass on price signals to non-residential end users. So security of supply for residents is most important, and industry will be facing these additional price signals, which are part of the market reform efforts that Jan mentioned, are important for established users like China. And there will be also power rationing to some of those industrial consumers that have major demand for electricity. And these energy security measures have led to a perception that China's additional climate objectives with regards to a clean energy transition cannot or may not be met. However, in fact, I want to note that this is not necessarily the case, and it's important to separate coal supply from its consumption in the power sector, because there are some very dramatic numbers about the coal generating capacity pipeline in China. So China currently accounts for over half of the world's coal power plant pipeline, both in terms of if you're looking at what's under construction as well as what's under planning. And you can see here by phase the power stations that are in China versus the rest of the world. And it's a very dramatic pipeline. However, coal generating capacity in China will continue to grow given that this pipeline and those plants are already in motion, but that doesn't necessarily mean that overall coal consumption can't peak and decline, which will absolutely be necessary for China to meet its 2030 emissions peaking target. So again, this graph here is showing coal's end uses, and about half is going to electricity generation. But there are many other sources, especially in industry, where policymakers in China are working to reduce coal consumption in order to secure supply for electricity generation. So just pointing out that power consumption does not necessarily mean that overall coal consumption is going to continue to grow. And I also want to talk about what China's doing overseas. As an established user of coal, has also played a major role in enabling overseas coal-fired power development. And so in September, Xi Jinping made an announcement at the United Nations General Assembly that China would step up support for green and low-carbon energy in other developing countries, and that it would not build new coal-fired power projects abroad. And I think a lot of attention has focused on the latter half of this statement, because China's overseas coal pipeline that it's supporting through finance as well as construction services is very significant. So the domestic coal pipeline is around 160 gigawatts, whereas overseas it could be up to 100 gigawatts, depending on if you're including financial as well as construction arrangements. And so in a policy brief that my center at Boston University launched this week, we quantified the types of support that China is providing for overseas coal plant development and dividing it into construction arrangements without associated finance, as well as capital participation via policy bank and commercial bank lending and equity investments. And what we find is that, in fact, a lot of these construction arrangements are driving the majority of overseas future coal pipeline development. And in terms of policy focus, it's important to not just think about China's financial mechanisms for supporting overseas coal, but also these equipment and construction services that are being exported. And it also has major implications for what's happening at home in China, because these construction arrangements have provided major economic opportunities for domestic companies within China in going overseas. That's a major part of the Belt and Road strategy. And so the choice that a lot of these companies that are specialized in coal development are facing is, do they need to double down at home in order to maintain market share, or can they diversify? And so what's interesting in the wake of Xi's announcement about phasing out overseas coal is that just a couple of institutions have announced voluntary commitments that are in line with that. For example, the Bank of China, as well as Tsingshan, which is a private steel-making company that does operate overseas. And so there are indications that this high-level policy will propagate to different actors that are enabling coal overseas. As well, China's state-owned enterprises that have been traditionally involved in fossil development are increasingly diversifying into renewable energy. And there are also the private companies that have been enabling renewable energy overseas need to also have opportunities to scale up and continue to go out. So I think there is a lot that remains to be seen about how Xi Jinping's announcement will be applied, to what institutions it will be applied to, and how it will be implemented. But the hope is that this will propagate and lead to greater focus on renewable energy, both inside of China and outside of China. And so I will stop there. I just encourage our audience to check out our interactive databases that are tracking China's overseas energy finance. We have one that includes upstream and downstream sectors, as well as one focused on the power sector, where you can get more information about what I've been discussing today. And with that, I will pass it to the next speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. I'm now also back and fully part of the meeting. One thing I wanted to mention, I forgot to say in the first place, that online participants are of course encouraged to post questions in the chat, or after the panel discussion, we'll also have a Q&A where you can raise your hand and we'll give you the floor. Please excuse me if we cannot address all questions because we have very limited time. But thanks to all speakers so far for keeping in time, and I would like to hand over to Chris. Yes, yours, Chris.
Okay, then I would like to know whether I can be heard and whether the slides can be shared. Can you hear me, Michael?
I can hear you. My information is that we will just put up the slides you sent us. Is this correct?
Yes, that is the arrangement. So today
could somebody just put up course slides, please, from Glasgow? Yeah, here they are.
It's coming. Okay, so today I would like to spend a little bit of time focused on the recent developments with regards to the energy transition in Vietnam, and specifically coal, and even more specifically recent developments as in the last few weeks, days, and even yesterday. Next slide, please. Vietnam's emissions, greenhouse gas emissions now and later, they are primarily from energy production and consumption, a very, very large share, also industrial processes, and further down the line, waste, agriculture, and LULUCF, which are the 5 categories normally reported. Energy is all about fossil fuels, even though Vietnam has a substantial amount of hydroelectricity production, and it also has increased rapidly and spectacularly, arguably, solar PV and wind power. Electricity still today is, however, about 2/3 of the ever-increasing amount of coal and gas consumption in Vietnam. Also coal and gas for cement, steel, fertilizer, and other industries, household use, and of course, for transport. Next slide, please. Here you see an overview of Vietnam's updated NDC with 3 scenarios: the business as usual in 2030 and the 2 conditional and unconditional reduction scenarios compared to business as usual. And here you see these 5 same categories of emissions, and you can see what I just said, the incredible dominance in 2030 2020, but in particular in 2030, in all scenarios of the energy consumption and production sector. You can see that industrial production is increasing until 2030 in all scenarios. You can see that, yes, there is a somewhat additional amount of sequestration going on in the LULUCF sector, reduced emissions in agriculture and waste. But all of that is relatively marginal compared to what is happening in the energy sector. Next, please. So what are Vietnam's objectives in energy transition? Are they about a fair or just energy transition? Are they clearly about a transition in the first place? Not very long ago, the Communist Party of Vietnam published a resolution, Resolution 55, and it was very widely appreciated. This resolution is setting the orientation for further energy policies in the country. The broad objectives are perhaps national energy security, support to economic growth, industrialization and modernization, and keep energy affordable for all, some kind of just element there. The objectives, thus, they might lead to a just transition or environmental quality according to Resolution 55. But other policy that we have seen so far is paying lip service to employment, social equality, environmental quality, climate change, and not more than that. Next slide, please. So we've seen several drafts of what is known as Power Development Plan 8. This is leading the country in the next 10 years in its power development, in deployment of power production capacity, transmission, and related aspects or policies. This is happening currently. It is still under development, and it is happening in the context of the past, you could say, 3 years, in which there has been a spectacular deployment of solar power and also wind power, offshore or nearshore wind power, some onshore wind power. Spectacular in the sense that solar power was virtually zero 3 years ago, and it now is about 1/4 of installed power production capacity of the country, with something around 17 gigawatts of solar power installed in Vietnam in just about 2.5, 3 years, which makes Vietnam a leader, not only in the region, but arguably in the world. Now, that is, of course, with a low capacity factor. The sun only shines during the day, and the problems emerged immediately upon this massive deployment, which is all about curtailment. It is about solar energy being generated, but it cannot be absorbed in the system because of a lack of storage or arrangements to use the existing storage, and it is about a lack of transmission capacity. At the same time, this succession of drafts of Power Development Plan 8 are alarming. They are about a massive deployment of coal power, yes, also increase in gas thermal power. So the very latest draft, which was published in September, October, and submitted to the Prime Minister, would settle for the first 5 years of continuation of what is mostly already under construction of 9 gigawatts, then a 5-year period where 14 gigawatts would be deployed, and then another 8. That means no more coal power after 2035. This was already 10 years quicker compared to an earlier draft. Next slide, please. But then in 2021, the country and every other country was preparing for their participation in COP26, whilst Vietnam was also preparing some major national strategies on climate, on green growth, and also on various parts of the energy sector. And then in the run-up to COP26, the high-level diplomatic exchanges increased. It became fairly clear a few weeks ago, perhaps a few months ago, around September and the UN General Assembly, that the geopolitical importance of climate change had become an enormous pressure on the country not to be left out. China, we've just heard, other countries started making announcements which increased ambitions, and in particular, the idea of long-term emissions cuts leading to net zero. Vietnam was still talking about somewhere in the second half of the century reaching net zero, perhaps in 2099. There were inside the country major differences about who would, some ministries or entities within the government and party feeling that it would be much better for Vietnam to be ambitious and to modernize various industries, including power, and others, the vested interest that we have heard Jan talk about, delaying this process as long as possible. Scientists, NGOs, and various citizens groups, and also lower level governments have made clear that they do not like coal very much for a whole range of reasons. And that also was very clearly communicated to the very top of the country and heard. And then not long before and during the COP, the leaders of Vietnam announced three key things. They announced more, but these are three key things. Net zero by 2050, although it's conditional, which is much more ambitious than people had expected. Many people had expected. A plan to hardly develop any new coal, substitute it as much as possible with LNG and renewable energy, as well as signing up to the coal phase-out proposals that had been discussed in Vietnam with the international community over a period of a few months. Phase out in the 2040s. And then the third point is an increase in the share of clean energy by 2030 or 2045 by a reasonable percentage. Now, these are noble goals, but the three do not match each other. The number 2 and number 3 cannot go along with the number 1. So clearly, there is an inconsistency in these policy announcements. So which one weighs most heavily? Next slide, please. What is very clear is that whatever is going to be
I would just like to remind you of the time, because we also
1 more minute.
Need to come to an end, and we can touch on many of these points in the discussion. I mean, thank you very much.
There is many things are still to be done. Sorry, can I get my previous slide back? There are many things still to be done. And the most important thing that I want to communicate here is that actually yesterday, the Prime Minister's office announced that the Ministry of Industry and Trade is expected to revise again its Power Development Plan 8 in order to make it consistent with the 2050 net zero or zero carbon target announced by the Prime Minister about a week ago. This is highly relevant because now suddenly all kinds of things have to be put in place in order to make it perhaps at least theoretically possible to reach net zero. This cannot be done by any other means than reducing the coal emission, also the gas emissions in the near future. It cannot be done by carbon capture and storage as far as various bits of analysis are concerned. I stop here then. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, please excuse me for interrupting you. But we'll have more time in the discussion later, and I'm very curious to hear more about especially the inconsistencies you mentioned and how to move forward. So with this, I would like to pass on to Neva's presentation. Thank you very much for being with us. Neva, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So yeah, a lot of the themes that have already been touched on emerged in South Africa as well. One big difference is that our emissions per person are extraordinarily high. They're around 7 times the average for upper middle income countries, excluding China, and about a third higher than China. The main reason is the economy is very dependent on coal. It's basically a mining dependent economy, but electricity has always been generated primarily from coal, and which it accounts for about almost 2/3 of coal production and 80% of electricity generated. But also we produce around 20% of our liquid fuels from coal, and we export around a third of our coal production. I think, the question is why. If we want to change it, we need to understand why it's so deeply rooted in the economy. And the answer is that from the 1930s, cheap electricity based on cheap coal was seen as a way to attract investment in the mining value chain, increasingly including refineries for metal that are very electricity intensive. So the refineries are electricity itself, liquid fuels, but also downstream, particularly aluminum, and some other very electricity intensive products such as chrome. And it's interesting that the metals production started actually in the 1990s after the end of apartheid in 1994. So as of around 2020, the coal value chain, including the refineries, accounted for around 5% of the GDP. Around half of that was in electricity. Also around 5% of South Africa's exports. It's one of our top 10 exports, coal. It generates around 85% of electricity, like I said, 20% of liquid fuels. But because it's so capital intensive, it only generates around 1.5% of total employment. So it's a very small employer, but it has a huge impact on other economic dimensions. And also it's very geographically limited. So coal production and most of the coal-based electricity generation occurs in around, and also all of the liquid fuels production occurs in 3 districts in Mpumalanga, which is a historically industrialized region to the east of Johannesburg. What this means is that the energy transition is hard to manage and contested because because coal has been so fundamental to South Africa's economic development, we need profound shifts in institutions and decision-making systems in both the public and private sector, as well as the kinds of decisions that have been talked about in terms of managing the costs of the transition. So the government is committed to phasing out coal, particularly for electricity, and it's expected that we'll see most of the downsizing in the next 10 to 15 years. Already we expect to reduce the share of coal in electricity generation to about half by 2030. It may actually be less, we may actually get there sooner because the state-owned utility that's responsible for most electricity generation sees that coal is a dead end and is trying to get out of it. But to do that, it's trying to raise international funding, and it also has to get permission, and the state itself is somewhat contested on whether these plans should be accelerated. I think that the problem in terms of the framework set by the initial input is South Africa is an unusually unequal society. We're one of the most unequal societies in the world in economic terms. And of course, that also aligns with ethnic differences, which makes things more difficult. And what that means is that the benefits, costs, and risks of the transition vary tremendously between groups. And that, of course, lays the basis for substantial contestation. So there are very clear and immediate benefits for businesses and households. So organized business totally supports the transition as a group because the generation of coal is now unambiguously more costly than clean energy, and South Africa has huge wind and solar resources. Although we don't have any hydro, which is, people have noted, it's a problem when your renewables are not stable enough to supply a baseload. And on the other hand, coal-fueled electricity has become very expensive and unreliable for a variety of reasons. So even now, as we speak, we're seeing rotating blackouts. That is what we call load shedding because of breakdowns in the big coal plants. But also there's a recognition that South Africa is so coal intensive that our exports will be blocked unless we find a way to reduce emissions. And obviously climate change is having a particularly harsh impact in Southern Africa in the interior already. We're seeing repeated droughts and floods, and there's an interest in mitigating that. But I think, as people have said, it's important to see the risks and costs as well as the benefits and also who bears them. And as people have said, the costs are that some assets and also the coal resources themselves that people expected to be profitable for many more years have to be written off early. That we have to invest in new technologies in transmission and grid management. So we expect to spend around 80, sorry, I'm trying to put this into dollars, around $80 million to expand transmission to access new renewable sources in the next 5 to 10 years. We have to find a way to replace coal as a baseload, because again, wind and solar by themselves, you either have to have storage or you need some other source of energy. And there will be likely job losses, especially in mining, and those are considered good jobs in South Africa. So to be more specific in terms of the coal value chain, businesses and workers in the refineries are looking to find new feedstocks. And in fact, like I said, in the case of the electricity utility, they expect that they'll be able to adapt going forward without substantial losses, assuming they can get the energy technology to work. But the coal mining itself will decline. And there's about 80,000 people employed in coal, and some of the biggest local companies are invested there. In that context, it's important to see some of the impacts already of the response to climate change, because essentially in this year, but as of this year, virtually all of the big foreign investors in coal mining have sold out of the industry. So we now have basically local companies that own the mines. And that, of course, has big political economic implications, because they're better able to lobby the government probably than foreign companies, but they also have less capacity to go into other industries. I may add, there is some pressure from China, which is some Chinese companies are trying to build a huge power plant here based on coal, which violates all of the government's plans. They've been blocked on environmental grounds so far, but it's interesting to hear the previous input on that. I also think that part of the problem in South Africa is that we have very high joblessness and slow growth as a result of apartheid, but also the dependence on mining. So that means the workers in their communities in these mining areas have a justified fear that they'll be left behind when the industries close down. So the businesses can usually find some way to get out and get into other opportunities. But if you're a miner with only a secondary school degree, you've had a reasonably stable and well-paid job up until now. But if it goes away, you may never find a job that is as good as that in this country unless there's government intervention. So in effect, what you have here is a classic problem for economic policy, where you have benefits that are huge, but they're broadly spread and actually intangible, while the costs are concentrated on a relatively small and well-organized group. As elsewhere in the world, the compromise has been to say we will have a just transition where workers and their communities will be protected. The problem is, as we've heard from other countries, because the transition is really only happening in 10 to 15 years, to be fair, but there are not specific plans on the table to achieve that. And given South Africa's longstanding slow growth and deep inequalities, implementing them will be very difficult. And also, the thing about the just transition is it removes a lot of the political base to oppose the transition, because you get workers in their communities benefit, but it doesn't do anything for the local companies that currently own the coal mines. And that clearly is becoming an issue going forward. Thanks.
Niva, excuse me if I interrupt. We also need to come to an end to also allow...
I was ending there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were already at the end. Okay, even better. Thank you very much. So without much further ado, I hand over to last speaker, last but not least, Felix Mattes.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike, for the invitation. If you could load my presentation. I have spent more than 50 years of my political career at the interface between number crunching and politics with coal phase out. I have been a member of the German Coal Commission, and there a member of the negotiating committee who tried to design the deal. And what I would like to present to you are some lessons learned from this process. And if the presentation would come, this would be a benefit for all of us. Okay, then I start without the presentation, but I would kindly ask you to, okay. So I would like to give you some context, some history, some perspective, and I will end with 6 key lessons learned from the German coal phase-out policy. The next slide, please. The first is that for Europe and for Germany, climate policy is the key driver. You can see here the historical emissions for the different sectors. The black bars is the energy sector, and the energy industry or the energy industries represent between 60 and 80%, depending on the country, of the energy sector emissions come from coal. And you can see here that for the 2030 targets, an almost complete coal phase out will be needed for the European Union. That means for Germany, even for Poland and other countries. And this is the phase 1 of coal phase out. I would like to highlight that there's a second phase, because the phase number 1 for the coal phase out is coal used for power generation. What we are at the moment in the middle of the discussion is the coal phase out from the steel industry, because this is another very significant share of the emission shares, and this is about hydrogen, etc. However, climate policy is the most important driver, and coal phase out is the single most important emission abatement measure for Germany and for the European Union. Next slide, please. One of the experiences from the German energy and climate policy and the European policies is that coal phase-outs needs to be a part of a policy package, because one of the drivers, especially for coal phase-out debate in Germany, was that we have increased the share of renewables in the power sector. The problem was the emission didn't come down. Because the renewables have number 1 pushed the coal-fired power generation into the exports, and number 2 the low carbon power generation was squeezed out. So the lesson learned that it needs to be a package, a part of a package, which is about the phase out, about the phase in, but also about important issues like infrastructures. Next slide, please. And this is only to give you a background why there is not the one and only coal phase out. This is Germany. The blue part is the western part, the green part is the former communist part. And you can see here the different coal mining areas, hard coal and lignite. There was a long phase out of hard coal in the western part. There's only 1 mining region in the western part. And what you can see here is that the major challenge for the coal phase out is in the poorer part of Germany, which is the former communist part in the eastern region, where we have still significant mining of lignite and where we have significant power production from lignite. And so the lesson from this graph is, number 1, there is a need for differentiation between the coal phase out in terms of shutting down coal-fired power plants, which are in the western part of Germany, if it comes to hard coal, essentially imported hard coal. The other story is about the coal mining, which is the more painful part. And thirdly, that the regional context in terms of wealth, etc., is an important determinant for the coal phase out. Next slide, please. I don't want to give you all the historical details of the coal phase-out policy. There's a hard coal phase-out. There has been essentially no attempt for a phase-out of coal-based power generation or lignite power generation until 2015. In 2015, it became very clear to the political system that focusing on the phase-in alone, be it on carbon pricing, be it on renewables, will be not sufficient to meet the emission reduction targets. And that was the point where the German government set up these German Coal Commission, where the official title was on growth, structural change, and employment. Again, I was a member of this commission. They came to conclusions. These conclusions have been implemented, and then we got the European Green Deal, and we had new emission reduction target, and so it became very clear that the recommendation and the implementation of the recommendations of the Coal Commission have only been the first step, and I will come back to this later. We have now another role of the carbon pricing, and we have a new climate neutrality goal for Germany 2045, and we will probably in December have a new government, and we will have new and additional policies on coal phase out. Next slide, please. I think one important issue, if it comes to the lessons learned, is that there is an energy and climate policy pillar of the coal phase out, and then there's an employment and regional policy pillar. And I would like to highlight some of the issues. The first is, if it comes to the energy and climate policy pillar, the German coal phase out is not based on the one and only mechanism. Essentially, the coal phase out is based on 5 different mechanisms. There is a market-driven element, fuel prices, CO2 prices. There are decommissioning tenders for hard coal power plants. There is a negotiated decommissioning premiums for the combination of lignite-based power plants and lignite mining. We have another interesting program for substituting cogeneration plants, which play a major role in some of the German regions, where part of it is based on coal. Substitute these by a low or even zero carbon cogeneration, and after 2030, there's a legally forced closure of power plants without any compensation, etc., etc. So this is the phase-out part. There is the phase-in part if it comes to renewables, if it comes to infrastructure, which is one of the key determinants for this major transition. There have been established more stricter rules on system adequacy, which is an important issue and will end in changes of the market design. And there have been heavy investments in innovative technologies, which are needed. I said these, the coal phase out number 2, if it comes to the steel industry. And the interesting point is that a lot of the research and innovation cores have been allocated to the coal regions if it comes to hydrogen, etc., etc. Next slide, please. The employment and regional pillar. I think one of the lessons learned in the Coal Commission was that there are strong ties between the jobs and the regions, but if you come to the details, that there's a strong difference what the importance and what the time horizons are for action on the job losses and the regions. Because if you want to make this very simple, dealing with the job losses is dealing with older people. Dealing with the future of the regions is dealing with the young people. And the requirements for actions are extremely different if you focus these from these 2 sides. Next slide, please. This is only an indication what, next slide, please. This shows you an indication what the problem is. On the left side, you see the age pyramid of one of the lignite mining regions, which is 140 kilometers away from Berlin. And on the right side, you see the age pyramid for Berlin. And here you can see what the real challenge is to make the former coal regions attractive for young people, because this is the real secret behind the future of these regions. Next slide, please. And so the Coal Commission has developed a program which I call the 3 Eyes SEC program, because it has essentially 6 clusters. The rollout of infrastructure, investment support for the coal regions, the building innovation cores, settling government agencies to the coal regions, including the military. So the deal maker of the Coal Commission the last night was the allocation of a tank brigade to one of these former coal regions, because these are also jobs in these regions, etc., etc. We have an interesting element, what we call the adaptation allowance scheme, which was developed during the times of the hard coal phase out that allows workers from the coal industry to retire earlier without getting any deductions of their pensions. And very important that there is a sixth pillar in this regional program which supports civil society and communities, because in many of the coal regions there's a cultural dimension, and the coal industry plays a major role for sports associations, etc. etc. There is a lot of money. I don't want to go into the details, but one of the interesting points here, and that leads me to my 6 lessons learned, is we were in the Coal Commission in a deadlock when it came to how to design these regional support programs, because there was a resistance and nobody really wanted to have a discussion on this. And in this situation, the Coal Commission said, okay, we don't want to decide on these adjustment programs from a top-down perspective. We said, the top-down perspective is the coal phase-out and the climate policy, etc., etc. And then the Coal Commission asked the regions, what are your proposals and visions for your region in the post-coal time? And then all these regions had to develop their regional visions for the coal phase-out complementary programs and the future without coal. And these regional visions have been made a part and a legally binding part of the support programs, these 46 billion for these regional programs. And that has been one of the issues which are very important, that we asked the regions, and they had to develop their future visions. There was the promise to get money, but then and you see this still in the legislation. There is for each coal region a legally binding development vision, which builds the framework for the allocation of funds. On the next 2 slides, you can see, and I don't want to go into any detail.
Felix,
I will come to my 6 lessons learned.
To come to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
The next 2 slides show you all these programs, which only shall underlie that this is not about storytelling. This is about specific programs, specific projects, and specific allocation. And that leads me to my last slide, to the 6 lessons learned from the German experience. The first lesson learned is it is important. There's no doubt that this is an important step. Secondly, it needs to be, the coal phase out needs to be part of a broader climate and energy and policy and strategy mix. It is about phase out and phase in, and I would highlight and infrastructure. Thirdly, coal phase out has been in Germany a stepwise approach, and will in many countries be a stepwise approach. This has advantages and shortfalls. The advantage is that you can base this process on evidence-based learning. You can build trust, because the second step is almost easier than the first step, and it could remove political barriers. But the first steps also corner the next steps in terms of mechanisms, so that the situation that the German coal phase out is based at least partly on compensation payments has been a fallout of the first steps of the coal phase out, which were built on compensation payments. Fourthly, predictability of the outcomes is crucial in energy, climate, and regional policy terms. That means it is about a combination of phase-out mechanisms which could support or which could help to improve the predictability. Fifthly, the just transition requires specific policies and jobs and supporting mechanisms for the regions, but there should be a clear differentiation, at least in conceptual terms, that the one track is about the older people and the future of the regions is about how attractive these regions are for the young people. And the sixth and important lesson from the German experience is that you need to trigger bottom-up processes to develop these visions and programs and projects for the coal phase-out regions, because this is somehow bringing some accountability in the process, and it frees the ideas and concepts for those regions, which in the end of the day only can come from these regions. Thank you very much. I will be happy to take questions or to go into these discussions on the many detailed experiences of this exciting pathway.
Yeah, thank you very much, Felix. And I propose we seamlessly move to the panel discussion. I would like to start with one question to each panelist, and of course invite everybody to follow up with questions, and then we don't have a lot of time to give a final assessment of the key insights of the section. So Felix, directly one question to you, and I would invite everybody to be very concise and just answer in 1 minute. Actually, the German approach to coal phase-out has been successful, but it has been quite expensive. It has cost a lot of public funds, and how far can these experiences be transferred to other, especially low-income countries that might not have the same financial means as Germany? And what actually do you think would need to be adapted for countries, let's say, such as Vietnam, to phase out coal in a politically feasible way?
Yeah, there's a lot of money involved, but if you have a clear look, then only a small share is allocated to the phase out. I gave you some indication on the numbers, and 80% of the total cost is essentially to support the regions. And this is obviously a challenge for less wealthy countries, but frankly speaking, it also addresses the overarching gaps between the rural and the metropolitan areas. And my theory would be that the 46 billion which in Germany will spend to support the regions, compared to the 5-6 billion which are compensation payments, etc., etc. This is essentially a policy and capital allocation which was needed anyway to bridge the gap between the metropolitan and the rural areas. And I think there's a lot of money involved, and there is a need to involve a lot of money because the gap between the rural areas and the metropolitan areas, and that has mentioned for South Africa and others, these are problems which need to be addressed anyway, whether there's coal phase out or not. And therefore, one should always be careful. The German coal phase out has not been the extremely cheap one, but 80% of the funds are allocated to bridge the gaps which needs to be closed anyway somehow.
Thanks a lot. And talking about money, I directly have one question to Neva. So South Africa has entered an agreement to mobilize $8.5 billion to support the just transition in South Africa, which of course could help to address poverty and inequality that you mentioned. What actually would be needed to get the money to where it's needed, to really make sure that the money accrues to those people that need it most?
Yeah, so first, can I just say something briefly in terms of the German experience, which is one of the things in South Africa I'd be interested about other countries is our coal mining districts are actually relatively advanced, and they're poor by global North standards, but they're not doing badly by South African standards. So it's not so simple just to say we're helping the poorest of the poor. In fact, we would be helping relatively privileged regions, and personally, I think that's going to cause trouble down the line for the just transition. The just transition deal is actually more about helping Eskom, that is the big electricity utility, shift away from coal earlier, and less about the funding the just transition in the sense of providing new livelihoods from people in coal. So some of the funds would go for that, but the bulk of it is about investment in new energy sources. And there's a whole lot to do there with how Eskom is financed. In terms of, so again, like everything else in South Africa, being a very unequal and divided society, the just transition is and will continue to be contested. We've done a lot of work for the Department of Environmental Affairs and the Climate Change Commission on how do you identify the groups that need to be helped, and also making the argument, is I think accepted here, because we have quite a strong democracy, that they need to be empowered in the process. But as everybody knows, saying that is much easier than doing it. No? And what I was trying to say is we really haven't started implementation yet. And so, we have some initial projects, we have experience from other places. How it will play out will be very interesting. No?
Okay, thanks a lot. And of course, you very much focused on the inconsistencies in Vietnam's policy agenda to phase out coal. What do you think are the most important or the most promising avenues to push coal exit forward in Vietnam?
I think the most important technical thing that needs to happen is all about storage and transmission of electricity. And that, of course, requires enormous amounts of investment. Recent history in Vietnam has demonstrated that a lot is possible with private investment in generation capacity. If the market conditions are right, it is just happening. I think in terms of the transition challenges around employment in mining or in the new technologies, the future technologies, I like to call them, that is a huge challenge for a relatively young country such as Vietnam, because the quality of workers, of education, of vocational training programs, but also of university courses needs to increase in order to be able to take all of this as an opportunity rather than as a massive threat. It will certainly not have the money that Germany has been able to generate for coal, for the transition, for plowing into rural areas. On the other hand, it faces the same challenges, that there is this massive gap between city and rural area. And so I sympathize a lot with the idea that FedEx was communicating, that it is not just about coal transition. There is a development challenge that needs to be addressed anyway. Now, obviously, Vietnam can't do it with the same amount of euros that Germany has, but it nevertheless must tackle it. I think that a continuation of planning for intermediary goals, monitoring what is going on, is also going to be a very major challenge. The intermediary goals are required for now till 2025, till 2030 and beyond. We can't start thinking about what happens in 2050. And that will be the political challenge, which has started literally yesterday by the Prime Minister sending back a draft national plan to a ministry, which is fairly unprecedented, I have to say, for that to happen 3 times in 1 year. So there is a lot happening, and a lot has to happen. It will meet many challenges, but again, it is a young nation. It has minerals that are required for new technologies. It has a very large workforce. So if it gets it right with capacity development and policies that enable private investment, it can go very far, very quickly.
Great, thank you so much. And actually, we already reached the end of our allocated time, but I think we can go 2 or 3 minutes over time, and I would like to give one final question to Cecilia. So China has announced to phase out financing of coal-fired power abroad. What do you think, and to what extent can this contribute towards accelerating the energy transition in other countries? And how credible are these announcements? How do they actually interplay with other countries' announcement to stop financing for coal?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that there's a huge opportunity for China to shift its foregone support for coal generating capacity overseas towards renewable energy. China has the technical expertise, the manufacturing scale, as well as the financial mechanisms to shift that support towards renewables. Instead, there could be $800 billion opportunity for developing countries to meet their NDCs through renewable energy capacity expansion, and China is well poised to take advantage of that investment opportunity.
Great, thank you so much. So if there are no further questions, I think we can close the session. I would like to thank all speakers, all panelists for these very insightful inputs. And maybe I can also give the word back to Glasgow, to Jan, to also say a few final words. Thank you very much.
Yeah, also from my side, thank you very much for the insightful presentations. And I think for the years to come, it will be very interesting and also relevant to see how the announcements that have been made to phase out coal will now be translated into policies that can actually work in the real world and that take those political economy challenges into account, that they're huge, as we have heard, but that are also not solvable, so to say. So thanks again. And have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.